Hey guys, it's Nick. I'm out here in Athens, Greece, and I'm in front of the Greek Parliament building. And in this video, I want to talk about the deal that Greece did with Goldman Sachs so that they can enter into the Eurozone and adopt the euro as the Greek currency around 2000. Now, this plan to get around the Maastricht Agreement rules for countries to get into the Eurozone was hatched, I imagine, somewhere between the Greek Parliament building and Lloyd Blankfein's office in New York City. He was the former Goldman Sachs CEO, but at the time of this deal, he was head of the department that made this deal, so most likely he had a big hand in making this. So why is this a big deal? A lot of people blame Goldman Sachs for helping Greece cheat to get into the Eurozone, but it takes two to tango, and in this case it's probably three that are tangoing, because it's Goldman Sachs, Greece, and the Eurozone pretending not to know what was going on with this deal, and they let Greece in anyway. So what were the rules that they had to follow to get into the Eurozone on the Maastricht Agreement? There were a few of them, but the main ones were that the yearly deficit had to be 3% or under. And what that means, the national deficit, is if you make $100,000 in a year and you spend $103,000, that's a 3% budget deficit for the year. You're spending $3,000 more than you make. So at the time, Greece was over that amount, and you needed to have, more importantly, you needed to have a 60% debt to GDP ratio, meaning if you made $100,000 a year, you had $60,000 or less in debt. But at the time, Greece had like about 100% debt to GDP ratio. So they were not even close to the so-called Maastricht Agreement, but there was a lot of fine print and fudging and all of that. Like, for instance, the Maastricht Agreement says 3% budget deficit, but then they say, well, if it's between 3 and 3.5% and there's some extenuating circumstances, blah, 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 or the debt to GDP ratio that had to be 60%, Greece's was 100, but then they said, well, if you are going in the direction of reducing your debt to GDP, then that's okay too. So that's what Greece did. And so basically what they did is, let's say you wanted to get a loan to buy a house, and the bank said, well, we need to see that you have 20% of the purchase price in the bank, and you don't have that. You're basically going, okay, well, I don't have that. I'm gonna take a cash advance on a credit card, a real high interest rate credit card, take this cash advance loan, put it in my bank account, and then show my bank the bank balance and go, see, look, I have that money here. And they go, wink, wink, okay, I guess we can give you the loan. Meanwhile, they know that you borrowed the money from someplace, but you're officially, sticking to the rules, the letter of the law, and so they give you the loan. And that's basically what Goldman Sachs was. It was a high interest credit card loan to Greece to make it look like they reduced their debt to GDP by about $2.8 billion or something like that. And that was enough to show that they were moving in the direction of moving down their debt to GDP ratio. I'm sure the people in the Eurozone knew all about it. And like I said, it takes three to tango. They were a new currency at the time. They wanted to get as many countries in to show that, it's a unified thing. There's all these countries in it. So I'm sure they were like, wink, wink, look the other way. They knew what was going on. And Goldman Sachs was never accused of doing anything technically illegal. Everything they did was legal. They even sent an email to the Eurozone Commission or whatever it was, asking about the swap, maybe not particularly telling them that they were doing it with Greece, but either way, what they did was legally by the book, although that rule changed in 2008, some years later, after Goldman had already sold off that deal to a Greek bank in 2005. So they're already off the hook. They made their $800 million on this $2.8 billion deal. So that's, you know, close to 25 to 30% they made on this currency swap that they did with Greece. And so how did it work? Kind of like this. Let's say you have a Japanese grandmother and she loans you $2.8 billion, right? Happens all the time, right? So she lends you $2.8 billion, but in yen, right? The equivalent in yen. And if you were to convert those yen into the price of euros at the time, you would have $2.8 billion, let's say. But instead of converting it into euros, Greece gave that $2.8 billion to Goldman Sachs. That's part of the currency swap. So they give them yen, and Goldman Sachs gives them euros to put in their bank account. But here's the trick, and apparently you never do this in currency swaps, but the currency rate that they use to do this swap, they called a historical rate, meaning it wasn't the mark-to-market rate at the time, the euro rate at the time. It was a historical better rate to make it look like Greece got more money. So they gave them more euros than they would have if they gave it to them at the current exchange rate. So Greece put a whole bunch of money into their bank account. It reduced their debt to GDP by about like 2%. All right, nothing. It didn't wipe it out. It didn't bring it under 60%. It just showed that they were going in the direction of reducing it, and that was enough to let them in. And so, you know, this wasn't even the first time this kind of thing happened. Italy did something like this in the 90s as well. So it's not like nobody knew about it. And so why did this become such a problem? Well, because the way the swap was made was that Greece expected interest rates to stay the same or go higher. But after 9/11, everybody was lowering interest rates to boost the economies, and their initial $2.8 billion that they borrowed ballooned to owing $5.1 billion. So basically they got hosed on this deal. Goldman Sachs got their $800 million, sold it off in 2005, and Greece, you know, went on to do a whole bunch of bailouts multiple times, had capital controls, shut down their stock market for 5 weeks in 2015. So, and you know, all of this wasn't because of this Goldman Sachs deal, okay? There was all kinds of other things going on. For instance, Greece's GDP dropped significantly after 9/11 because the majority of their GDP comes from shipping and from tourism. And so their GDP dropped something like 25%. Unemployment was like 25% or something like that. So their tax receipts significantly diminished because of this. And so they had problems paying down their debt, even though their debt at some point was only going up from like 300 billion to like 318 billion. Their debt to GDP jumped from like 129% to like 170% or so, because they weren't increasing their GDP. GDP was going down. So for people who say, you know, that it was all Goldman Sachs that caused them to get into all these problems, no. You know, multiple parties were involved: the government, Goldman Sachs, the Eurozone. They all knew what was up, and they kind of looked the other way and just hoped that it would get better, or as more commonly, the politicians that got the Greeks into this deal knew that they would get their money and they would be out of office, and before any of this stuff blew up, they would already be retired on the beach somewhere with you know, millions of dollars or whatever, as is usual, not just with Greece but with any place. So that's kind of a rundown of how the whole Goldman Sachs currency swap with Greece to get them into the Eurozone worked. I hope you like this video, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.